Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31, 1939, in the small town of Webster, South Dakota. From the very beginning, his life was marked by hardship. As the second-born son, his arrival deeply disappointed his mother, who had longed for a daughter. This resentment shaped his childhood, as he endured relentless physical and emotional abuse at her hands. Affection was something he never knew. No kind words, no comforting embrace, only harsh beatings and relentless scoldings. Throughout his early years, the Brudos family moved frequently across the Pacific Northwest, never settling in one place for too long. Eventually, they made their home in Salem, Oregon. By then, Jerry was a deeply unhappy child, carrying the weight of neglect and cruelty. Yet, in the midst of his misery, he stumbled upon something that finally gave his life meaning. One day, while exploring a local junkyard, he came across a pair of high-heeled shoes. Mesmerized, he took them home and, once alone in his room, slipped them on. The way they felt excited him, but his moment of curiosity was abruptly shattered when his mother caught him. Furious, she ripped the shoes away and punished him severely. However, rather than discouraging him, this experience only deepened his obsession. As he grew older, his fixation expanded beyond shoes to include women's lingerie. He began stealing undergarments from neighbors, carefully hiding his trophies. By the age of 12, his compulsions escalated. He stole high heels from his teacher and undergarments from his classmates. His actions were alarming enough that he was sent to therapy and even admitted to psychiatric hospitals, yet nothing seemed to change his behavior. Adolescence only intensified his impulses. He started targeting women, attacking them by choking them into unconsciousness before fleeing with their shoes. The stolen garments became objects of fixation, fueling his fantasies of control and domination. At 16, he took his obsessions a step further. He abducted a young girl, physically assaulted her, and threatened her with a knife. His attack was interrupted by an elderly couple who happened to pass by, leading to his arrest. Once in custody, he confessed without hesitation. Psychiatric evaluations revealed a deep-seated hatred for women, particularly his mother, stemming from years of mistreatment. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, though doctors believed his behavior was rooted more in immaturity than true danger. Convinced that he would simply outgrow his disturbing tendencies, they released him after 9 months. Upon reaching adulthood, Jerry attempted to integrate into society by enlisting in the military, but his unusual obsessions led to his discharge. Shifting paths, he trained as an electronics technician. In 1961, at 22 years old, he met Darcy, a 17-year-old girl, and quickly fell in love. They married soon after and had 2 children. However, Jerry proved to be as cold and violent toward his children as his mother had been toward him. Affection was non-existent, and discipline came through force. With his wife, however, he was intensely passionate, yet his desires took on an unsettling form. He confided in Darcy about his fantasies, insisting that she perform household chores while wearing nothing but high heels. He also demanded to photograph her in provocative poses. Though she felt uncomfortable, she feared confronting him. One evening, he approached her wearing women's lingerie. Shocked by her reaction, he seemed hurt, as if expecting her to understand. Over time, Darcy discovered his growing collection of photographs of women. Though she was disturbed, she let it pass. Eventually, she refused to be intimate with him. By the mid-1960s, Jerry began experiencing severe headaches and frequent blackouts. He insisted that the only way to relieve his symptoms was to go on nocturnal raids, where he would break into homes and steal women's shoes and lingerie. These stolen items were his treasures, carefully hidden in his garage, a place he guarded fiercely. To ensure no one disturbed his secret world, he installed an intercom system that alerted him if anyone approached. After years of theft and obsession, in 1968, Jerry decided to take his fantasies to a far darker level. 19-year-old Linda Slauson was a door-to-door saleswoman working hard to save money for college. On January 26, 1968, her sales route took her to a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. When she knocked on Garen's door, he was immediately drawn to her. His most sinister urges awakened. He lured her inside with lies, despite the fact that his wife and children were home, eating lunch. Once she stepped inside, he struck her hard, knocking her unconscious before dragging her silently into the garage. Not a single member of his family heard a sound. Inside his private lair, he strangled Linda to death. Afterward, he carefully undressed her, replacing her clothing with items from his collection. He then slipped high heels onto her lifeless feet and posed her for a series of photographs, preserving the moment forever. After committing his first murder, Jerry realized he couldn't keep Linda's body hidden in his garage forever. Determined to preserve a piece of his crime, he used a hacksaw to remove her left foot, placing it in a freezer. His intention was grotesque. He planned to use it as a model to shape the high-heeled shoes he had been collecting. The rest of her remains were disposed of a river, tied to a car engine before being pushed off a bridge. When he returned home, he fixated on the severed foot, slipping different pairs of heels onto it and taking photographs. It became his most treasured trophy. Meanwhile, Linda's disappearance went unnoticed for weeks. Her family reported her missing, but the publishing company she worked for had no record of the homes she had visited that day. Tracking her movements was impossible. Eventually, the police found her abandoned car, but there were no signs of a struggle, no missing belongings, nothing to indicate foul play. If she had been abducted, the perpetrator had been meticulous. With no leads, investigators moved on, and the case faded into obscurity. Jerry, however, was elated. He had committed what he believed to be the perfect crime. But the satisfaction didn't last. His hunger for violence only grew stronger. Over the following months, he perfected his method, striking again and again. On November 26, 1968, 23-year-old Jan Whitney was traveling home for Thanksgiving when her car broke down between Salem and Albany. The breakdown created the perfect opportunity for Jerry to appear as a helpful stranger. He offered her a ride so she could call for a tow truck, and she accepted, seeing no reason to be wary. But as they drove, he suddenly attacked her with a leather strap before subjecting her to further abuse. Afterward, he suspended her body in his garage, leaving it hanging from a pulley for several days. During that time, he dressed her, photographed her, and assaulted her again. Taking his depravity even further, he amputated one of her breasts and created a resin mold, turning it into a grotesque paperweight. When he was finally done, he tied her body to a heavy metal object and dumped it in a river. A few days later, police discovered Jan's car abandoned by the roadside near Albany, exactly where it had broken down. The car was locked, and authorities theorized that she may have sought help from a passing driver. Like Linda before her, Jan simply vanished. There were no clues, no witnesses, and no leads. Jerry remained untouchable, and his thirst for blood only intensified. On March 27, 1969, 18-year-old Karen Sprinker parked her car outside a department store, unaware that she was moments away from a nightmare. As she stepped out, Jerry, this time disguised in women's clothing, appeared and forced her into his vehicle at gunpoint. He drove her straight to his garage, where he once again carried out his horrific ritual. He forced her to model his collection of lingerie, photographing her in disturbing poses before strangling her with the garage pulley. Even in death, his cruelty continued. He mutilated her body, removing her breasts to create additional resin molds. Finally, as he had done before, he weighed down the remains and discarded them in a river. That afternoon, Karen's mother waited for her at a downtown restaurant, excited to reunite with her daughter after months apart, but Karen never arrived. After waiting over an hour, her mother grew anxious and called the police. Investigators quickly located her car in the department store's parking garage, her keys and belongings still inside. Witnesses reported seeing a tall, odd-looking woman in the area that day, but one person claimed to have realized that this woman was actually a man in disguise. Though it was an unusual detail at the time, authorities had no reason to connect it to Karen's disappearance. Less than a month later, on April 21, 1969, 24-year-old Sharon Wood left her job in Portland to meet her ex-husband and discuss their divorce. As she reached her car in an underground parking lot, she suddenly felt something hard press against her back. A voice ordered her not to scream. Turning around, she saw a tall, freckled man pointing a gun at her. It was Jerry, hunting for his next victim. Sharon had no intention of becoming another statistic. She fought back with all her strength. In the struggle, she managed to bite his hand, drawing blood, and tried to wrestle the gun from him. Enraged, he slammed her head against the concrete, momentarily stunning her. But before he could finish what he had started, he heard footsteps approaching. Panicked, he fled, leaving Sharon battered but alive. A witness called the police, and Sharon gave them a detailed description of her attacker, a tall man with blue eyes and freckles. But when investigators searched the area, no one matching that description could be found. The very next day, on April 22nd, he attempted to abduct 15-year-old Gloria Smith in Salem. He tried to force her into his car, but she managed to escape and report the incident. Like Sharon, she described a large, freckled man driving a sports car. Investigators noted the similarity between both attacks, but without physical evidence, the suspect remained unidentified. Then, on April the 23rd, 22-year-old Linda Salee set out to buy a gift for her boyfriend. As she walked through a mall parking lot, Jerry approached her, flashing a fake police badge. He accused her of shoplifting and threatened to arrest her unless she followed his instructions. After bringing Linda to his garage, Jerry restrained her, leaving her tied up while he went about his day. Although she didn't attempt to escape, she fought back when he returned and tried to strangle her with a leather strap. Unfortunately, her resistance wasn't enough to save her life. Once she was lifeless, he indulged in his usual twisted rituals, but this time, he hesitated to mutilate her body. He found her skin too soft, too unmarked for his usual gruesome acts. Instead, he experimented with electricity, attempting to make her corpse twitch under the current, an attempt that ultimately failed. Unsatisfied, he followed his familiar disposal method. He tied her remains to a car transmission and dumped them into a river. The following day, Linda never showed up for work. Her car was found abandoned, just like the others, with no sign of a struggle or robbery. As in previous cases, her disappearance left investigators without any immediate leads. Suspicion briefly fell on her boyfriend, but there was nothing to connect him to her vanishing. By this point, the Oregon police began to notice patterns among the missing women. They built a timeline, realizing that all the victims had disappeared in the latter half of each month. Most were young white women, many of them students, last seen in public places, mainly parking lots. However, despite these observations, they had no physical evidence to pursue. That was, until an unexpected discovery changed everything. On May 10, 1969, a fisherman spotted what looked like a bundled package floating in the water. When he approached, he realized it was something far more sinister, the weighted-down body of a woman. Still wearing her coat, the corpse had been tied to a heavy toolbox. Authorities arrived quickly, and forensic analysis soon identified the remains as one of the recently missing women, Linda Lee. The autopsy confirmed she had been strangled, with additional post-mortem injuries that stood out. 2 puncture wounds, one on each side of her rib cage, were surrounded by burn marks, evidence that someone had used electric shocks on her body. Investigators were now certain they were dealing with a sadistic killer, someone who took pleasure in tormenting his victims even after death. 2 days later, as divers continued searching the river, they made another grim discovery. A second body, severely decomposed and tied to the engine of a car, was pulled from the water. The bindings matched those found on Linda, suggesting the same killer was responsible for both murders. The victim had been strangled, likely with a leather strap. Investigators strongly suspected the second body belonged to Karen. Her mother had described the outfit she was wearing when she disappeared, and the clothing on the recovered body matched, except for one detail. The victim was also wearing an oversized black bra, stuffed with crumpled brown paper towels. It became clear that this was part of the killer's bizarre fantasies. When dental records confirmed the body was indeed Karen, detectives realized they were officially hunting a serial murderer. Determined to track him down, investigators built a psychological profile of the suspect. He was likely between 20 and 30 years old, had experience with electrical work, evidenced by the copper wiring used to restrain victims, and was methodical in his actions. The double knots used on the bindings suggested someone skilled with their hands, possibly a technician or engineer. They also theorized that he had grown up in a household dominated by an abusive mother, which could explain his deep-seated rage toward women. Despite this promising profile, they still had no clear suspect. Turning to the social circles of Karen, detectives visited her university. They questioned her classmates, hoping to uncover any unusual encounters before her disappearance. Several students reported receiving disturbing phone calls from a man pressuring them to go on dates. Others mentioned a suspicious red-haired heavyset man frequently seen loitering around campus. The breakthrough came when one student recounted a recent meeting with a man claiming to be a war veteran who just wanted someone to talk to. She had agreed to meet him on campus and provided a description. He was tall, had light-colored hair, and was covered in freckles. This matched the descriptions given by previous victims who had narrowly escaped. The student recalled that during their conversation, the man had made unsettling comments about the missing women whose bodies had recently been found in the river. When he invited her for a walk, she declined, sensing something was off. Before leaving, he promised to call her again the following week. Now, detectives saw an opportunity. They urged the young woman to accept his next call and arrange another meeting while police prepared to intervene. On May 25th, as expected, the man called again. The student agreed to meet him, and an hour later, he arrived at the university. He was exactly as described, tall, freckled, and overweight. Detectives, who had been waiting nearby, immediately took notice. When questioned, the man introduced himself politely. His name was Jerry Brudos. He explained that he worked as an electrician, lived in Salem with his wife and 2 children, and seemed completely at ease. His composure was unsettling. There was no nervousness, no sign that he felt threatened by the police's presence. Lacking concrete evidence to detain him, detectives had no choice but to let him go. However, before he left, they noted the license plate number of his car. Back at the station, investigators ran his information through the police database and uncovered 2 crucial details. First, Brudos had a history of psychiatric treatment for disturbing sexual behavior. Second, records showed that Linda Lee, the missing encyclopedia saleswoman, had been in his neighborhood shortly before she disappeared. It was the first real link connecting him to the crimes. Determined to confront their prime suspect, detectives made their way to Brudos' home in Salem. As one detective engaged Jerry in conversation, the other discreetly examined his home, eventually reaching the garage. There, he found more copper wires, some tied in the same intricate knots that had been discovered on the victims pulled from the river. Suspended from the ceiling was a sturdy hook, eerily similar to what had been described in the forensic reports. Suspicion mounting, police obtained a warrant to search Brudos' car. Inside, they found that the interior had been meticulously cleaned, too thoroughly, as if he had tried to erase any trace of evidence. Though this alone wasn't enough to charge him, detectives soon remembered the statement given by Gloria, the 15-year-old girl who had escaped an attempted abduction. They arranged a police lineup, and when Gloria was brought in, she immediately identified Brudos as the man who had tried to force her into his vehicle. This was the break they needed. Brudos was arrested and held on multiple charges, including possession of an illegal firearm, as a gun had been found in his vehicle. Realizing that police were closing in on him, he instructed his wife to burn his collection of women's clothing and lingerie, items that could directly link him to his crimes. However, Darcy, who had long grown tired of her husband's disturbing behavior, did not comply. Instead, she allowed investigators full access to the garage, leading to the discovery of what would later be known as the Chamber of Horrors. On May 29, 1969, Brudos was formally taken into custody as police conducted a second, more thorough search of his home. This time, they uncovered a hidden stash of women's high-heeled shoes, along with an extensive collection of lingerie, including bras, girdles, panties, and slips. But the most damning evidence was a set of photographs, images so disturbing that they left no doubt about his guilt. Among them were pictures of Brudos himself dressed in women's undergarments, but far more chilling were the photographs of his victims. One image depicted a lifeless body dressed in various outfits, posed as though it were still alive. However, one photograph sealed his fate. It showed a young woman dressed in black lace lingerie and garters, suspended from the ceiling by a rope. A mirror on the floor reflected the gruesome scene from below, and in the lower corner of the frame, the reflection of the killer was captured, Brudos himself, staring with satisfaction at the corpse he had just posed. Initially, Brudos denied any involvement in the murders. However, under intense questioning, he finally broke. He admitted to murdering and mutilating 4 women, tossing their remains into the river after keeping select body parts as souvenirs. What struck investigators most was his complete lack of remorse. He spoke with enthusiasm about his fetish for women's shoes, underwear, and the thrill he felt posing his victims. He expressed no regret for their suffering, only for his own fate, lamenting that his life was ruined and feeling sorry for his wife and children. On June 4, 1969, Brudos was officially indicted. He initially pleaded not guilty, and his trial soon became a media sensation. He attempted to claim insanity, portraying himself as a victim of an abusive mother who had shaped his deviant tendencies. He even wept before psychiatrists, hoping to gain their sympathy. But the experts weren't fooled. 7 psychologists reviewed his case and rejected his insanity plea, diagnosing him instead with antisocial personality disorder. They concluded that, while he was deeply disturbed, he was fully aware that his actions were wrong. He was described as a narcissistic psychopath with a high IQ, calculated, manipulative, and entirely self-absorbed. Realizing there was no chance of an acquittal, Brudos changed his plea. He confessed to the murders of Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Saley. He also admitted to killing Linda Slauson, the encyclopedia saleswoman, but was never convicted for her murder, as no remains were found, nor did he keep photographs of her. On June 28, 1969, The court sentenced Brudos to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His reign of terror was officially over. His wife, Darcy, was briefly arrested and investigated as a potential accomplice. A neighbor claimed to have seen her assisting Brudos with one of his victims, but there was no concrete evidence to support the claim. Without proof of her direct involvement, she was acquitted. In 1970, she divorced Brudos, changed her name, and disappeared with their children, severing all ties to the notorious killer. Meanwhile, Brudos was sent to Oregon State Penitentiary, where he maintained a well-behaved facade. He remained obsessed with high heels, even writing to shoe companies, requesting catalogs as a substitute for his fantasies. Life in prison wasn't easy for him, however. He was frequently targeted by fellow inmates, one of whom slashed his neck in an attack that required multiple stitches. After that, Brudos withdrew from the spotlight, refusing interviews out of fear that his notoriety would incite more violence against him. Over the years, he filed numerous appeals, including one in which he argued that the infamous photograph of him with one of his victims was inadmissible because the victim wasn't one of the 3 women he had been convicted of killing. He also cited medical issues, claiming he had suffered from blackouts during his crimes, and that reality had become increasingly distorted for him. In June 1995, he made one last attempt at freedom, arguing that he was no longer a danger to society. The Oregon Parole Board swiftly rejected his request, stating that he would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. There would be no further hearings. His final years were marked by declining health. After suffering from liver cancer for several years, he died in the prison infirmary on March 28, 2006, at the age of 67. At the time of his death, he was the longest-serving inmate in the Oregon Department of Corrections,